My mother looked me straight in the eyes, her voice colder than the marble floors of our pristine estate, and said, "We never wanted a son, Lucas. You were a flaw in our blueprint." That was the final conversation we had before they shipped me off to a strict out-of-state academy the exact week my younger sister was brought home from the hospital. They expected me to break, to beg to come back, but when I flatly refused to return to San Francisco after graduation, my mother was completely furious. My parents never wanted a son. To them, I wasn't just an accidental birth, I was a living, breathing resentment. They had meticulously mapped out a flawless high society life revolving around two daughters who would inherit and elevate their luxury real estate empire. My mere existence shattered that perfect aesthetic from the moment I cried in the delivery room. They couldn't even look at me without a thick cloud of pure disappointment darkening their eyes. Maybe it was because my features didn't align with the elegant, curated lineage they had envisioned. Maybe they simply lacked the human capacity to love something they hadn't specifically ordered. Either way, I grew up knowing I was their ultimate burden, a permanent, unerasable reminder of a calculation gone completely wrong. The realization didn't hit me all at once. It was cemented on a rainy night when I was barely 5 years old. Our mansion was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all sharp angles, towering glass walls, and wide-open spaces designed to showcase wealth, not harbor secrets. I remember creeping out of my bedroom, drawn by the sound of muffled, venomous voices coming from my parents' private wing. It was that specific kind of hushed, furious arguing that adults falsely assume children are too naive to process or remember. Through the narrow crack of their double doors, I watched my father pacing the room, his shadow stretched long against the minimalist decor. He was telling my mother in a strained, exhausted whisper that it wasn't her fault, that these biological anomalies just happen sometimes. But my mother was completely hysterical. She wasn't just crying, she was vibrating with rage. Her voice occasionally pierced the quiet house as she screamed about how she was meant to raise daughters. She kept weeping about how this ugly twist of fate wasn't supposed to happen to people of their standing. They were not supposed to be that couple, the ones publicly saddled with an unwanted boy. My father didn't even attempt to defend my right to exist. He merely tried to manage her psychological crisis, treating my birth like a bad business investment they had to endure. Listening to her throw that tantrum branded something permanent into my chest. I stood there in the dark hallway, looking down at my own hands, feeling an intense, heavy shame for simply occupying space in their world. I realized that my bedroom wasn't a sanctuary, it was a holding cell for an unwanted product. Every interaction after that night made perfect sense. The lack of bedtime stories, the sterile family dinners where no one asked about my day, and the absolute absence of physical warmth. I wasn't a child to them. I was a structural defect in their grand design, a piece of faulty foundation they desperately wished they could tear down. They looked right through me, completely blind to my presence, already plotting a way to build over the mistake I represented.
Immediately after my birth, my parents embarked on a desperate clinical crusade to correct their boy problem. They flew to every premier genetic and fertility institute in the world, Johns Hopkins, Boston IVF, specialized laboratories in Zurich, and elite clinics on Harley Street in London. My mother's life became a calculated regimen of hormonal injections, advanced vitamins, and high-priced consultations. She was obsessed with engineering the perfect family dynamic she had planned. I was just the background noise to her obsession. When I turned 6, they returned from a high-profile medical center in Manhattan. My mother was glowing with a triumphant look I had never seen before. She was pregnant. Instantly, any lingering cold stares she used to give me vanished. She simply stopped seeing me altogether. Her pregnancy was treated like a royal succession. She stepped away from the corporate offices entirely, surrounding herself with personal nutritionists, elite fitness trainers, private doulas, and the most expensive specialists money could buy. When my sister, Chloe, was born, the entire family dynamic shifted permanently. She was their golden child from her very first breath. I still remember the sterile perfection of the nursery when they brought her home. My mother held her like a flawless, priceless diamond, her face radiating a twisted sense of aristocratic pride. They named her after a line of old-world nobility. The contrast was devastating. I was merely tolerated like an unwanted piece of furniture, while Chloe's existence was a continuous celebration. Every minor milestone she reached was treated like a historical achievement. The week Chloe settled into the mansion, my parents packed my life into leather suitcases and shipped me off to Blackwood Academy, a secluded, high-discipline boarding school buried in the freezing mountains of Vermont. They spun it as an incredible opportunity for a young man, but the underlying truth was brutal. They wanted me purged from their curated family portrait. Blackwood was a fortress for the children of senators, tech billionaires, and old-money dynasties. The campus was immaculate, featuring manicured courtyards and massive stone libraries. But I knew on day one I was a ghost. High society kids possess a predatory instinct for weakness. They figured out instantly that my parents had abandoned me. They realized I was a throwaway child. In the dorms and stone corridors, they weaponized my isolation, mocking me with nicknames like the glitch, the prototype, and the leftover. I would sit in the grand dining hall, listening to them whisper, "Look, there's the son they replaced." I kept my head down, but the words left deep, invisible scars. Other boys had parents who visited every month. Nobody ever came for me. As the years dragged on, my parents became completely transactional. They visited exactly once a year for a cold 30-minute meeting to audit my grades and lecture me on upholding the family name before rushing back to San Francisco for Chloe's ballet recitals or equestrian competitions. Every cent they spent on my tuition felt like a tax they resented paying. The only person who saved my sanity was my Aunt Danielle. She was my father's younger sister, but she completely rejected the family's ruthless corporate culture. She lived in a modest apartment and ran a dusty, independent workshop in Oakland, where she restored antique architectural structures and raw woodwork. She didn't drive a luxury vehicle. She drove a beat-up, oil-stained pickup truck. But she was the only human being who showed up. Danielle would drive up on weekends when the campus was empty. We didn't talk much, but her presence was my anchor. In her workshop, breathing in the scent of cedar and sawdust, I learned the value of building things from the foundation up. She would tell me stories about how my father's toxic ambition had forced her out of the family circle because she chose honest craftsmanship over corporate greed. I understood that alienation completely. By the time I hit my teens, I had learned to internalize the pain. I stopped reaching out for love that didn't exist. I poured all my isolation into sketching blueprints, physics, and structural design. I was surrounded by supreme privilege, but I was utterly alone, enduring the cold until I could finally break free.
By the time I graduated from Blackwood Academy, I knew one thing for certain. I was completely done with my parents. Yes, they had funded my entire life and possessed the financial power to send me to the most prestigious institutions, but emotionally, they had completely divested from me years ago. Financial support was the only language they knew how to speak, and I was entirely fine with that. Now, I no longer craved their affection or sought their validation. I just needed their capital, and I was fiercely determined to use it to put as much geographical and emotional distance between us as possible. After graduation, I chose to move across the country to Chicago to study sustainable architecture and urban design. I wanted a complete reset, a fresh start in a sprawling metropolis that held absolutely no memories of me being the family defect or the son who failed to fit the mold. I got into a premier design institute, and my parents didn't offer a single word of resistance. Honestly, I think they felt a profound sense of relief. My father wired a massive lump sum into my account, covering my tuition, a high-end apartment, and living expenses. He was secretly ecstatic about the distance. Having me thousands of miles away meant they could easily maintain the pristine public facade of a benevolent, united family, while never actually having to look at my face. Chicago was everything I needed it to be. The raw energy of the city and the brutalist architecture gave me the perfect canvas to reinvent myself. I threw myself into ecological structures and self-sustaining materials, determined to build my own wealth and prove I could dominate an industry without relying on my family's corporate shadow. But university brought its own set of rigid hierarchies. The old money crowd in the architecture department, mostly the heirs of major commercial developers, were quick to remind me that my progressive ideas didn't belong in their world of glass and steel. They made slick, passive-aggressive comments about my focus on green tech, calling it glorified charity work for the lower class. It wasn't the overt bullying of my childhood, but a constant elite condescension.
I ignored them completely. I had been an outsider in my own home. A few privileged snobs weren't to break me. My internal blueprint was clear. Build something revolutionary, get incredibly rich, and never look back. During my junior year, I met Noah, a relentless structural engineer from Toronto, and Sophia, a brilliant material science major from a hardworking, working-class background in Detroit. We bonded instantly over our mutual hatred of the shallow, destructive practices of traditional real estate development. Sophia became my absolute anchor. For the first time, someone looked at me and saw value, not a mistake. Together, the three of us began brainstorming an independent studio called Nova Habitat, focusing on self-sufficient, net-zero luxury spaces. We scraped together every single dollar from internships and national design awards, accumulating exactly $250,000. It was a shoestring budget for an architecture firm, but it was ours. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, Chloe was thriving as the corporate golden child, groomed to view me with absolute contempt. She was dominating her elite management circles, and my parents doted on her endlessly. The ultimate fracture happened during my final year at a major national architecture exhibition in Chicago. Nova Habitat had a tiny, modest booth in the corner. Chloe unexpectedly strolled in with my parents' top executive entourage. She looked at our intricate timber and solar models with an expression of pure, refined disgust. She walked right up to me, her face a mask of practiced upper-class charm, and whispered, "You know they only finance your life out here so you don't ruin our brand back home, right? You're designing fancy shacks for peasants, Lucas. You'll never sit at our table." That was the absolute end. I walked out of the exhibition hall that night, cut off their access to my life, and swore I would never return.
Nova Habitat was gaining solid momentum, but just as the future began to look bright, the first structural collapse happened from within. It started with a phone call from Aunt Danielle. We hadn't spoken in a couple of weeks, which wasn't unusual given our grueling schedules, but the second I heard her voice, I knew something was deeply wrong. The fierce, rhythmic cadence she usually possessed was entirely gone, replaced by a strained, hollow whisper. She brushed my concerns off, claiming she was just exhausted from a heady timber restoration project at her yard. A month later, the reality shattered my world. I received an emergency call from a hospital in Oakland. Danielle had collapsed in the center of her workshop. I dropped everything, boarded the first flight out of Chicago, and raced to her side. The clinical truth was a fatal blow. Stage 4 cancer. She had known for months, but kept it entirely hidden, refusing aggressive treatments that would chain her to a medical ward, choosing instead to live her final days on her own terms. A suffocating wave of intense guilt crashed over me. I should have pushed past her privacy and noticed the physical toll, but she had always been an impenetrable fortress of independence. By the time I reached her, she was drifting in and out of consciousness. I sat by her bedside for hours, holding her calloused, weathered hand, completely powerless. She passed away the next afternoon, taking the last shred of genuine family warmth I had left in this world with her. Her funeral was a stark, quiet affair, attended only by a handful of local craftsmen and neighborhood friends who respected her grit. My parents and Chloe didn't bother to show up, of course. To them, Danielle was a corporate deserter whose death didn't warrant a break in their elite social calendars. A week later, her attorney called me in for the reading of the will. Danielle had left absolutely everything she owned to me. Her modest apartment, her life savings, and the historic waterfront workshop. It wasn't a massive inheritance by my parents' standards, but to me it was invaluable. It was the ultimate validation that I belonged to someone, that I was chosen. Desperate to drown out the hollow grief, I buried myself back into Nova Habitat, working 18-hour days alongside Noah and Sophia. But my parents weren't done punishing me for surviving without them. My mother, Victoria, was the true tactician of our family, possessing a cold, calculating malice that far outmatched my father's corporate arrogance. 3 weeks after the funeral, a formal notice arrived from their elite legal team. They were contesting Danielle's will. They claimed my aunt was suffering from severe cognitive decline when she signed the documents, and that her property, which sat on a prime piece of waterfront land my parents had been eyeing for a luxury high-rise development, rightfully belonged to the family empire. It was an intentional act of war.
Victoria didn't care about the monetary value of Danielle's savings. She was purely motivated by a desire to destroy my independence. In her twisted, aristocratic mind, my success without her approval was an unforgivable act of treason that needed to be violently corrected. The ensuing legal war was completely brutal. Backed by an endless corporate war chest, my parents' lawyers launched a vicious smear campaign, painting me in open court as an estranged, predatory nephew who had financially exploited a dying woman. It was a sickening distortion of the truth. Noah and Sophia stood firmly by my side as we hired a defense team, draining Nova Habitat's operational reserves to cover the escalating costs. It was no longer just about property, it was a matter of basic human principle. Simultaneously, my parents used their massive real estate influence to actively sabotage my firm. They spread underhanded rumors to city zoning boards and potential high-profile clients, claiming Nova Habitat was a fraudulent, legally compromised operation on the verge of bankruptcy. Premium residential contracts we had spent months securing suddenly vanished overnight. They wanted to see me broken, starving, and crawling back to San Francisco to beg for forgiveness. But looking at the blueprints of Danielle's workshop, I swore a silent oath that I would rather watch my business burn to the ground than let them desecrate her memory or steal my future. We doubled our efforts, worked through the sleepless nights, and braced ourselves for a prolonged, ugly siege.
Winning the court case felt less like a grand victory and more like a brief reprieve before the next inevitable storm. There was no real time to breathe. While we had successfully secured Aunt Danielle's waterfront workshop and publicly humiliated my parents' legal team, I knew them too well to believe they would simply accept defeat. They possessed limitless capital, generational influence, and a deep-seated malice that wouldn't allow them to let me walk away unpunished. But for a fleeting moment, I forced myself to focus on the explosive trajectory of Nova Habitat. Our firm was scaling at a pace that shocked the traditional architecture world. Despite my family's relentless smear campaign, our commitment to self-sustaining luxury spaces had caught the eye of massive eco-conscious investors. In less than 2 years, we had tripled our active client base, pushing our project pipeline value to nearly $500 million. Noah and I were already scouting a second flagship studio in New York, while Sophia was leading high-stakes negotiations with a premier European green infrastructure fund that promised to inject tens of millions into our proprietary material research. We were on the absolute precipice of breaking into the highest tier of urban development, the very world that had rejected me as a child. It was a beautiful irony. I was conquering their playground on my own terms, completely free of the Hastings name. Then, right at our peak momentum, the guillotine dropped. I walked into the office to find our legal team pale and silent. The Securities and Exchange Commission had launched an immediate, aggressive investigation into Nova Habitat for alleged securities fraud and insider trading regarding our green bond project financing. The accusation felt like a physical blow to the chest. Insider trading. In our sector, even the whisper of a federal probe is an instant death sentence. Noah, Sophia, and I had been absolute fanatics about regulatory compliance, knowing my parents would exploit any crack in our foundation. But legitimacy didn't matter. As the details of the investigation leaked, the architecture of the trap became blindingly clear. The anonymous tip had been meticulously orchestrated by a senior partner at my father's primary corporate law firm. They had planted entirely fabricated communication logs, claiming we had used non-public regulatory data from a tech titan client to manipulate our green bond valuation. The fallout was instantaneous and devastating. Our traditional institutional clients panicked. Fearing reputational damage, several major developers pulled their funding overnight, while others indefinitely froze our active contracts. We were bleeding millions of dollars a week. The high society whispers I thought I had buried in Vermont came roaring back. Industry elites began distancing themselves, muttering that I was always destined to be the volatile, catastrophic black sheep of a powerful family. It was the exact same crushing isolation I had survived as a boy, magnified on a multi-million-dollar stage. Right on cue, my father's empire announced a massive, heavily funded expansion into the boutique sustainable development space, launching a direct copycat firm designed to steamroll Nova Habitat. Backed by their immaculate reputation and endless capital, they immediately began poaching our bleeding clients, positioning themselves as the safe, untainted alternative to my compromised operation. I knew this masterstroke belonged to my mother. She had weaponized the SEC to cripple my legs, and now she was using my father's corporate weight to crush my chest. We were trapped in a losing war of attrition until Noah brought a radical high-risk counter-strategy to the table. He had been quietly building ties with a new guard of tech disruptors and venture capitalists who utterly despised the old money establishment. Among them was an eccentric, hyper-wealthy tech pioneer named Kalen Vance, who was looking to build an unprecedented multi-billion-dollar off-grid smart estate. Noah's pitch was simple: pivot entirely. Stop begging traditional risk-averse old money clients for approval. Rebrand Nova Habitat as a hyper-exclusive, forward-looking tech-savvy infrastructure firm for the new frontier of wealth. Sophia was hesitant, fearing the extreme volatility of the tech venture market, but we had no choice. We took the plunge. We aggressively rebranded, leaning into the chaos, and secured Kalen Vance as our anchor client. His massive financial backing completely stabilized our cash flow. Within months, the SEC officially cleared Nova Habitat of all charges, finding zero evidence of misconduct. It was a complete frame job. By the time the clearing statement was released, we had already evolved past the world my parents controlled. My father's copycat firm, bogged down with rigid corporate bureaucracy and an inability to innovate for tech-forward clients, collapsed under its own weight. My parents had used every weapon in their arsenal: lawsuits, federal frame-ups, corporate sabotage, and I had still outmaneuvered them. For the first time in my existence, as I stood in our sleek new studio looking at the digital blueprints of our global projects, the suffocating shadow of my childhood completely vanished. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was entirely free.
Nova Habitat didn't just survive the fallout, we completely redefined the architectural landscape. The official SEC clearance left our reputation bulletproof, and Kalen Vance's sustainable smart estate became a global benchmark for modern design. We were completely untouchable. Then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, my assistant paged my private line stating that someone was waiting in the lobby without an appointment. I walked out expecting a persistent vendor, but stopped dead. It was my mother, Victoria. She was standing near our raw timber installation, looking incredibly older, smaller, and stripped of the untouchable aristocratic armor she had wielded like a weapon my entire life. The pristine, commanding posture was entirely gone, replaced by a fragile, desperate exhaustion. I led her into my private office overlooking the river, the very space constructed directly over Aunt Danielle's historic waterfront workshop. She didn't sit. Instead, she stared at the thriving green courtyard below, her hands trembling as she clutched her designer handbag. The corporate facade cracked wide open. She flatly admitted that Hastings Financial Group was in a state of catastrophic, irreversible collapse. Their ruthless attempt to launch a copycat firm and systematically starve Nova Habitat had backfired spectacularly, draining their liquid reserves. In the wake of their failed corporate sabotage, deep scandals regarding environmental fraud had leaked to the press. Investors were fleeing en masse, and the board was preparing for liquidation. But the sharpest blow hadn't come from the volatile markets. It had come from their cherished golden child. Chloe, the perfect daughter engineered to inherit the family throne, had seen the writing on the wall. Weeks before the public collapse, she had quietly liquidated her personal trusts, siphoned off a massive portion of the remaining corporate cash reserves, and fled to Europe, leaving our parents to face the impending federal indictments and financial ruin completely alone. Victoria looked up at me, tears of bitter betrayal welling in her eyes, and finally uttered the words I never expected to hear. "Lucas, we need your help. We need you to acquire Hastings, to absorb the debt, to save our family name." I stared at the woman who had spent my entire existence treating me like a biological error, a permanent stain on her flawless grand design. For years I had fueled my ambition with a burning desire to hear those exact words, to see them brought to their knees, begging the unwanted son for salvation. But looking at her broken frame, I didn't feel a surge of malicious triumph. I didn't feel hatred at all. I just felt a profound, echoing emptiness. The old rage that had driven me through the freezing corridors of Blackwood and the sleepless nights of my 20s had completely evaporated. I was simply done. I reached down to my desk, my fingers wrapping around an old brass-handled wood chisel, the very tool Aunt Danielle had handed me my first weekend at her workshop, the tool that taught me how to carve my own value.
I spent my entire childhood twisting myself into knots trying to prove I deserve to exist, Victoria, I said, my voice flat and utterly immovable. It took me a long time to realize that I never needed your approval to build a life, and I certainly don't need your name now. I picked up the internal line and quietly instructed security to escort her out. She froze, staring at the tool in my hand, realizing the depth of the world she had thrown away. As the guard gently guided her out, she paused at the door, whispering, "I was wrong about you, Lucas." But by then, the words were meaningless. They held no power over me. That evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the river in deep shades of amber. The studio was quiet, the frantic energy of our global expansion settling into a peaceful stillness. Sophia walked in, her eyes warm and grounded, and slipped her hand into mine as we stood by the wide glass windows looking out over the water. For 20 years, I had been running from a ghost, fighting a war against a family that viewed me as a structural defect. But looking out at the empire we had built from nothing, breathing in the faint scent of cedar that still lived in the bones of this workshop, I finally felt something entirely new: peace. Not because I had defeated my parents, but because they no longer possessed the power to define who I was.